Now, before we get started, on behalf of all of you, I want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we are all on. I'm on the Gadigal land of the Eora people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that the land that we are all on was never ceded. Everyone knows the way, I hope, we run these shows, which is with the spirit of respect and curiosity. Be active in the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself if you're a first timer into the chat. I know we've got some of our regulars in the room already. Put your, Maureen's there and she's always there in the front row. Hi, Maureen. Put our cameras on if you like. Put the screen onto gallery view so you can see everybody that's around, and yeah, we'll get cracking. So this week's Essential Report really looked at 3 broad themes, and we'll go through those in our sort of structured conversation today. The first one was around the lockdown and the performance of governments, particularly state governments. We had a large number of questions on the economy, and we also asked a bit about energy. One of our team will actually put a link to the report in the chat so you can sort of see the full report, but we'll obviously go onto the slides as well in a sec. So before we jump into it though, are you there, Paul? No? So Emma, you're there?
I'm here.
How are you? And it's an exciting week coming up for you. We're actually got a really big event next Tuesday where Emma's new book, What Happens Next, which she will show you all, will be launched by the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, who's written one of the essays in the book, as has Emma, as have I.
Have you think? Absolutely.
And so tell us a little bit about the idea behind the book. We might also put a link in the chat for people now, because the deal for this one is there'll be a special cheap price to buy the book if you register for the Australia at Home for next Tuesday. So tell us about the book, Emma, before we get into the polling.
So this was conceived by myself and Professor Janet McCullman at the University of Melbourne back in March. So it's been turned around very quickly. And Janet and I were talking about the fact that we'd been thinking about reconstructing Australia's economy and society before the pandemic hit, in light of the desperate need for action on climate change and inequality. And we thought, well, now things are becoming urgent. So we got together, came up with a concept, and spoke to a lot of the people that we know in and around academia, politics, the labour movement and civil society, and asked them to contribute an essay on the topic of how we reconstruct Australia after COVID. And we've got some fantastic contributors, as well as Anthony Albanese and Peter, myself and Janet, obviously. We have other ALP frontbenchers, Jim Chalmers, Claire O'Neill, Andrew Lee, Mark Butler and Terry Butler. From the ACTU, Michelle O'Neill, John Falzon, who many of you will know, who's a per capita fellow, writing about a social guarantee and improving our social security system, Professor Fiona Stanley, Rob Moody, Roy Green, Stephen Parker, Emma Germano representing the Farmers Federation, talking about agriculture, Andrew Peterson from the Sustainable Business Foundation, Shireen Morris, and the opening chapters by Thomas Mayer, who's a First Nations man who's heavily involved in the Uluru Statement from the Heart movement. So it's a book really with a lot of ideas about how we can reconstruct Australia's economy to produce a more sustainable, equitable society, and provide opportunities for all of our children and grandchildren to live in a safe, secure, egalitarian and hopefully ecologically sustainable world. So it comes out next Tuesday. As Peter said, if you register for the event, the book launch next week, where Albo will launch the book, and we'll also have Fiona Stanley, Tom Mayer, Clinton Fernandez and myself and Janet to talk about the ideas, then you can get a 25% discount, and it's very reasonably priced anyway. I think it's about $30 for the paperback, and the ebook's even cheaper. So that's the book.
Well, not only was that a great overview of the book, it was a fantastic filibuster while we were trying to get Paul up and running for this discussion. I'm going to try it one more time. Are you there, Paul? Otherwise, we're just going to give up until Paul comes in. So he was in and out. So I guess the one thing about, sorry?
I'm just answering Anthony Smith. Yes, Liz Allen's in there too.
Oh, terrific, because she wrote that great book on demographics earlier this year. So, one of the interesting things about the book, given the timelines, was, and I was saying to you the other day, I'm a little bit embarrassed by my contribution, in that it was written at the end of the first wave of the lockdown before we went into the second. So I think it's really interesting to see which ideas endure that test of time, because I think right through this year, we've all been thinking on the run and, jumping to what comes next. But, one of the theses in today's essential report, and I think also in a column that I'll share that I've just put up on The Guardian, is I think we are entering a new phase of the response to the pandemic. And I think it starts with the federal budget in October, because, well, my analysis is up until this point, government's been dealing with a crisis in front of them, but now we're reaching the point where there are choices to be made. And I think those hard choices that governments have to make are going to be starting to be made now. And the budget is really the first step of that. And I think it's really timely that your book comes out just before that moment of forced choice.
That was the plan.
Yeah, well, you got there. All right, I'm going to jump into the numbers so that we can sort of ground our discussion a little bit in, well, what we use as facts, which is sort of public sentiment. The first slide just talks about the government performance responding to COVID-19. You can see it's like that kind of sense of flatlining sentiment. So there's a lot of noise around at the moment, but that sort of 60% mark, which has really been there since, winter, still holding pretty firm. Very good, up 3 points, which is obviously margin of error. Our sample of 1,000, we don't get too excited about movements of 2 or 3%, but that long line story really shows that, in terms of the government response to the pandemic, absent all the criticism of specific policies, there is still large-scale public support for the performance of the government. I guess that is a challenge for an opposition, Emma, but also I think for progressives who always believe that government is part of the solution, not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as you say, what's going to be interesting now is as we come out of the immediate crisis management phase, when everybody's pulling together, right, wanting the government to succeed to get us through the crisis, and those choices start to be made about the future. It'll be really interesting to watch how views may or may not change when the phrase federal government's response isn't just about immediate life support for the economy, but more about responding to the longer term trends. So it's going to be one to watch.
Yeah. Likewise, performance of state governments. This is obviously an area where there's a little bit more difference. Obviously, if you're in a state where you've had, borders closed and no virus, and we're talking WA, SA, and to an extent Queensland, strong support for government performance. A bit of an improve for the New South Wales government as well. And Victoria, 47-33, you wouldn't say it's salad days, but that narrative that the Victorian government has totally lost support of the public just doesn't stand up, does it? And I know, Emma, as somebody who's withstanding the lockdown with lived experience, and our thoughts to everyone that's in the discussion who are from Melbourne and still going through this horrible experience, they're still behind the government.
Yeah. And polls consistently show that. I mean, even... the news poll, they had to kind of admit that, well, we're all locked down and we don't love it. But the majority of Victorians believe it's the right thing to do and believe that it's worth making the sacrifice now in order to come out of it and try to get back to normal, as people have been able to in WA and South Australia. So I get, more than anything, a pretty strong sense of resolve of the people down here. And you don't have to be an I stand with Dan or a dictator Dan. You don't have to take, such extreme positions on that to sort of recognise that, well, it's uncomfortable, but we're not going to, fall at the last hurdle and make the last 6 months all for nothing. I think is everyone's just gritted teeth get through it now.
Yeah, and we've seen the numbers dropping week by week. You come out the other end of that, and I think you've got a government that's taken its people through a really tough time. We've got one other set of numbers around Victoria. We'll go through these line by line. And we've compared these with the sentiment 10th of August, which I think is right at the start of the lockdown. Forgive me if I got my timing wrong.
No, that's not right.
But we've still got, 74% of people saying they understand what's going on and what's required. 64% believing that it's worth the effort, which kind of reflects that positivity towards the government. Restrictions affecting my area seem appropriate, 60%. 45% changes won't have an impact on my own lifestyle. That suspects that we've got a lot of introverts who are answering our questions in Victoria. And the last one, which I'm not 100% happy with the way we're asking that question, state and federal governments are doing enough to help people and businesses that are negatively affected by the restrictions. So I think we probably need to divide that up between state and federal if we're going to be asking that in the long term. But regardless, the overall responses to these specific questions again show that huge backlash against dictator Dan is a kind of false narrative.
Yeah, it's very much it's a confection by certain elements, and they're certainly very vocal, but it's not biting with a lot of people. I think as much as they try to push that, there is a real sense of unity, and I think what it speaks to me is that Australians remain much more willing to take collective action than, for example, the US, where the cult of the individual is much stronger than it is here. That when it comes to the crunch, we're still kind of willing to say, okay, look, greater good, I'll make a big sacrifice. I think the 45%, the changes won't have much impact on my own lifestyle. Yes, Victorians, we're indoor people. It's been winter, so we can't go to the Melbourne Writers Festival was online, but other than that, I don't think it had a huge impact on the cultural life of Melbourne. Might also reflect there. I said to a lot of people, I haven't been out after 8 o'clock at night for about 5 years anyway. So.
John Remington, our chief geek, will also be able to fill me in on this question. So we've got the numbers here that agree with the statements. Am I assuming everyone else disagrees, or is there a don't know cohort in there as well, John? Particularly,
we had a midpoint statement in there, which is neither agree nor disagree. But
it'd be pretty hard to have no opinion at the moment if you're living in Melbourne, I would have thought.
We have seen there is a difference between Melbourne and regional Victoria in these statements. In regional Victoria, the agreement is generally higher than in Melbourne for all of those.
I'm going to cross my fingers and see if Paul Carp's there now. Are you there, Paul?
I am, Peter, and thank you for starting the show. I know it's a disgrace to take this long to get the tech working 6 months into a pandemic, but
sometimes we like to think our prima donnas enter the stage after we've done the opening act, so it's great to have you in here anyway. Hey, so jumping to what we're talking on at the moment, borders. It's been really highly politically charged, and it did feel like the Australian was doing a bit of a whoopsie this week when they realised there wasn't that bile being directed at the Victorian Premier.
Yes, and the numbers were much closer even in the news poll of Dan Andrews handling and Scott Morrison handling and the other Labor premiers. Palaszczuk's ratings were very high in the news poll still. So, that narrative that the big bad states won't come out of stage 4 lockdown or won't open up their borders hasn't really moved people's sentiment that much. I think the numbers you've got here probably indicate that people were just disappointed about how long the roadmap out of lockdown in Victoria was, but this would have been taken before the COVID numbers in the last couple of days, which have been stellar, and it might contribute to positive sentiment in Victoria.
I was actually expecting a bit of a backlash in Victoria with these numbers, because there was that sense that the benchmark that the Premier had set the states seemed to be almost insurmountable. So it is interesting that people have remained with the program, and I'm a little bit surprised about that, Emma.
Yeah, I think people are getting sick of it. But like I said, I think what's happened is at the point where we'd normally be going, oh, you know, enough, we can see an end in sight, and you sort of don't want to make everything that's happened for the last few weeks be for no reason. So it really is a kind of everyone's just head down, get through to the end now. Yeah. If there was another spike and we were set back again, I really can't predict how that would affect people, I think, pretty badly.
Yeah. Hey, the other border war is obviously being the push, the full court's press from the federal government for Queensland to reopen its border, and from the New South Wales government too, I might say. Again, really strong support for the idea that states should keep their borders closed. It's kind of almost the reverse border protection going on here, whereas the coalition for years have built political strategies around closed borders. They're really pushing for the opening. With an election 4 weeks off and 70% support for closed borders within Queensland, you just can't see those calls having much impact, Paul.
It's interesting that the opposition to the state borders is higher in Queensland than WA and South Australia. It makes me think that because the state election is upon us, people are viewing that more through a political frame. If you're for or against Anastasia Palaszczuk, and coalition voters know that they're supposed to be opposed to the border closures, where it looks like in WA and South Australia, people are answering the question a bit more straight. They're just answering on the borders rather than on the political debate. But yes, with 70% support for Queensland's borders policy, you can see why Anastasia Palaszczuk has been so steadfast in that, even in the face of examples of some, rough edges around that policy when exceptions weren't granted.
What is the partisan breakdown in Queensland, John? I know we say here that total support at 61% coalition voters supporting the lockdown, but it feels like they're running a pretty ambitious election campaign if opening the state up is going to be their line in the sand there, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think we can see there the support across. We put the partisan support at a national level there, and we do have amongst coalition supporters majority supporting the lockdowns. If we filter that to Queensland, yeah, it's still pretty high. So in Queensland, 61% of coalition supporters are supporting the lockdown. Higher for Labor at 86%, and small sample sizes, but also high for the Greens.
Yeah. Excellent. I'm going to come up for air. I'm seeing if there are any questions in the chat yet, and feel free to put questions in the chat as we go. But let's get into the real, I guess, guts of this week's report. And before we go to the numbers, Paul, I'm interested in a bit of a temperature check of 2 weeks out from a budget, what's being expected, what's the vibe around the Parliament at the moment? I guess there's not many people there at the moment, but what are the expectations for the upcoming budget, which people will remember has been delayed for a good 4 or 5 months. It was meant to come down in May, wasn't it?
Yeah, so there were a few months where they didn't even want to give the updated, figures of how bad the deficit was going to be, and they didn't want to announce new measures until they were more sure that the virus was under control and what scale of economic recovery was going to be needed. I think the most important context for the budget is that at the end of this week, JobSeeker and JobKeeper, the rate of those payments is going to be cut. So the budget is all about what steps into the breach when those payments get tapered off. And so the government has to point to other things that are going to stimulate the economy. So we're expecting some form of the tax cuts that have already been legislated to be brought forward, to be accelerated, a massive infrastructure spend, and possibly wage subsidies for companies that take on new workers. So no longer a focus of JobKeeper to just desperately keep people in the jobs that they already have, but more shifting towards incentives to encourage business to hire new people. But yeah, it's expected to be very big, like $200 billion deficit if they need to.
And to what extent do you glean any sense of new thinking? Like from the cheap seats, it seems to me it's largely a bit of a trickle down ethos still pushing. And I know, you know, there's been the flagging of fast tracking the tax cuts, which we'll get to in a minute. Is there anything that suggests that this little journey of 2020 has changed the way the government views its management of the economy?
Well, I mean, they certainly had to shift their rhetoric on debt and deficit from it being, you know, out of control and we're back in black. Debt and deficit being out of control under Labor and we're heading back into surplus this year. So they've obviously had to junk that very early because of the massive need for fiscal stimulus. So the whole budget will reflect that logic that they need to spend money. I think another smaller change that we'll see is that at the start of the crisis, the focus was on trying to not create new programs, whereas I think that now with more time to develop a stimulus in the budget, that they might be willing to try new things like wage subsidies for new hires. But that's a small prediction, and I think we'll have to wait and see.
You got any hot tips, Emma, with your hotline into the government offices?
No. I'm a keen observer as you are, but I think Paul's probably right. I think they're while they recognise the need for a recovery and for some government role in that, we've heard repeatedly from both the Treasurer and the Prime Minister that they want this to be a private sector-led recovery, that their measures will be about trying to support business to employ rather than directly creating jobs through government spending or government procurement or public sector expansion. And you can see that at the same time as they've been rolling out JobSeeker and JobKeeper. They've been reducing jobs at the ABC and the CSIRO and across the public sector. So I think Not
to mention the universities where it's the killing fields.
Exactly, it's the killing fields. I mean, there's, you know, thousands of jobs gone from unis and they've quite deliberately cut them out of the support program. So no, I think we can expect to see those tax cuts brought forward, probably some kind of business investment incentive, which the BCA was calling for a few weeks ago. So rather than cutting the headline company tax rate, they may introduce some kind of business investment incentive, which is similar to what the Labor Party took to the last election. And as Paul says, I think we can likely see some of those more supply side wage subsidies and so on, which I don't think will be terribly effective, particularly for small and medium businesses. My biggest concern is around the tax cuts. Unless they significantly change the distribution of those tax cuts, then they're going to be saved rather than spent. They won't go to anyone. I mean, anyone on JobKeeper and JobSeeker is not getting a tax cut by default, right? Because they're not on a wage. But even people earning sort of under 75, 80,000, which is the majority of Australian workers, won't see much out of that tax cut. So I think there are much better ways to spend that money. If you look at the businesses that have been so badly affected, it's retail, it's hospitality. It's very hard to directly stimulate those sectors by providing wage subsidies, because if there are no customers, then the business doesn't run. And I think we're likely to see depressed activity in those markets for some time until people feel confident. Doesn't matter how soon they lift the restrictions if people are still too scared to go out to eat. So some voucher system or something would be a much better solution there, but I don't know that any of that's on the cards. We'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into our findings this week, which really sort of see where the public mood is. No surprise in the first question. Before every budget, well, not even every budget, about once a year or twice a year, we ask how people describe the current state of the Australian economy. Not too flash at the moment. 23% think it's going well, 46% poor, 2% unsure, not many not really know. The good's an interesting number though, and I think there is still a sense that because the government has been putting money to keep businesses afloat, and they've effectively doubled the size of Newstart. There is a sense that we're not in an economic downturn yet. And it seems to be both, I guess, an achievement from the government to get us to this point, but also a real risk that things are going to hit a cliff in October.
Yeah, the doubling of the rate of Newstart with the coronavirus supplement and the JobKeeper wage subsidy actually had the effect that, you know, some household take-home pay increased, and especially the lowest decile, the lowest 10% by income, had a boost, and some of them were even able to save some of those government payments. But again, that changes at the end of September, and they might have a less rosy view then. You can also see that the unsure portion here, there was a small cohort kind of on the fence about how the economy was going, but it's now an even tinier sliver. You know, it's quite polarising circumstances for people.
Yeah, indeed. My favourite description of the economy was from Shane Wright, writing in Fairfax a couple of months back, where he likened it to the great movie from the 90s, Weekend at Bernie's, where a bunch of teenagers keep a bloke alive who's dead, carry him around in a suit, in a car and everything. And it does feel a little bit like we do have a Weekend at Bernie's economy. But again, the budget is going to be the point at which we work out if it's a corpse or just something that's looking a little bit poorly. A second question here to that is the expectations of voters in terms of whether the economy will improve or get worse over the next 6 months. I don't know if those stats say that with age comes the degree of wisdom or just pessimism, but you'll see that the older the voter, the more likely to think that there is more pain to come over the next 6 months. I suspect they're right. I think the political risk there is that if people don't see it coming, then they're kind of going to be, you know, blindsided a little bit.
Yep, I think this one's really interesting because, of course, people under 40, 45 don't have much memory of what it's like to be trying to work during a recession. So I came out of study the height of the last recession in the 90s. And the job market was really bad. You know, it was really bad for a long time. And I think people that remember that either lost their jobs or were trying to enter the labour force in the early to mid 90s would have a much stronger expectation that it takes longer than 6 months to get back to normal. So I think there's an element of the optimism of youth there, but also, you know, I think that's pretty interesting that people that are more that experience the last recession are more realistic about how long it takes to recover.
Paul, as the voice of youth in today's discussion, would you care to comment?
Yes, I agree. People in my generation have no experience of a recession. I mean, the global financial crisis happened while I was at uni, and you know, my generation did have a decade of slower wage growth as a result of that, but not, you know, mass unemployment. So they don't really have any experience of it. Also, it might be people's mood about how well the economy is going might be more based on whether or not they can go out. You know, whether shops and bars and cafes are reopening might result in more optimism in the lower age bracket. Could be it.
Yeah. This is interesting too, this next graph, and I might ask John whether there's an age difference here in a sec, but we asked people, and maybe the list was a little bit long, but which of the following indicators did people think was the most important when thinking about whether the Australian economy is in a good or poor state? As you can see here, it's kind of all jobs.
Yeah. And that's really encouraging to me, actually, because it's the most important. I mean, the cost of household bills is obviously the second one, but the fact that people, this speaks to me about something that I say all the time, which is that ordinary people don't experience the economy as GDP growth or the consumer price index or, you know, whatever the terms of trade are. They experience it by, have I got a job? Can my kids get a job? Can I afford my cost of living? And so that really speaks to that lived experience of the economy. But Yeah, it's all about the unemployment rate at the moment, even more so than, as you can see, last year, the cost of household bills was pegging fairly level. And that, I think, just reflects that people are, if they haven't already lost their jobs or lost hours of work, they are very fearful that they will. And I think there's a huge number of people on JobKeeper feeling very, very uncertain about what will happen when that subsidy is removed.
Yeah, Paul, it shows we've got a lot of economic indicators out there, but most of them are just not really on people's radar at the moment. Things like national surplus or debt or GDP. It comes down to what people can see in front of them, doesn't it?
Yeah, and the cost of household bills. I mean, a lot of people would have, tried to argue for a rent reduction or might have deferred their mortgage. There's no inflation to speak of at all. So those cost pressures fall away, and yeah, it's jobs, as you can see from the first column.
And, one of the things that strikes me, and it probably moves into the next slide, there is a risk for the government, particularly around the fast tracking of the tax cuts, that it's seen as not taking the jobs issue head on, and then they'll be forced to explain their theory of trickle-down economics, which takes some explaining, doesn't it, Emma? Because there's not a whole lot of runs on the board.
No. My favourite explanation of the trickle-down economics is John Kenneth Galbraith, where he said it's the theory that if you feed enough oats to the horse, some will pass through to feed the sparrows. So in other words, it's complete horseshit. So I think if they are forced to explain how that's going to work, it'll be pretty interesting. But this is an obvious opening to me for the opposition, and they're going at it tentatively, but there is no plan for jobs, for direct job creation and for active job creation that I can see so far. So if we do see a budget that really is just about subsidising existing businesses to hire more people, providing tax cuts in the hope that it'll get spent, rather than active engagement in industry policy and job creation, I think we're going to start to see a pretty sharp divide emerge between the two sides of politics after that.
There's a way they can try and sidestep the political argument would be to bring forward stage 2 but not stage 3, because stage 3 flattens the tax bracket for everyone from 45,000 to 200,000, so that'll be a massive benefit for people on six-figure incomes and millionaires even. So that would be highly controversial. But they could try and sidestep the massive argument about trickle-down economics that would cause by just doing stage 2, which benefits people more in the high five-figure income, not just people on six-figure income. So that's one thing they could do.
So it seems. Yeah, I think you're right. I think the high income tax cuts is just a meme factory, that for everyone that has a problem, there'll be somebody that's had a massive tax cut who probably isn't in the most deserving cohort. But it's also interesting, guys, that there's kind of three economic theories in a little bit of tension here. So there's one, and you'll help me with this, Emma, but one of them is the trickle down that we've spoken about, that you just get money at the high incomes and they spend it down. There's another one that says, well, actually, if you want to have more money in the economy, you're better off keeping JobSeeker and JobKeeper up, because you know that lower income people will spend all they've got. And then you've also got, in terms of jobs, do you actually create public sector jobs and just say at the moment the government needs to employ more people? Or do you do what Paul was sort of saying that the government might be flagging, which is that you give private sectors a bit of a nudge to hire more people, which requires a sense of confidence. It feels to me that last one is particularly problematic and smacks of the first wave of stimulus, where they were saying, oh, well, we'll let small business take out loans to reinvest in your business. But when you're trying to keep your business afloat, you're really not thinking about buying a new photocopying machine, are you?
Look, no, you're not. And that sank like a stone. All of that liquidity that was created in the first month went to big business and international corporations. Small and medium businesses don't borrow when the outlook is uncertain. Look, the fact that we could talk about the merits of those theories, but let's talk about the facts of history. The only thing that has ever worked to pull Australia or any other country out of a recession in the last 100 years is the direct intervention by government to create jobs. That was true after the Second World War under Chifley and Curtin. It was true in 1961 under Menzies. There was a massive collapse in private sector employment when Menzies tried to rein in inflation mistakenly, nearly lost the election, responded by creating 24,000, or 2/3 of the jobs that were lost came back through the public sector, and he took his foot off the brake on monetary policy. It happened with Hawke and Keating to get us out of the election under Fraser and Howard, and it happened after in the early 90s when Keating created his own recession and then responded with the Working Nation.
Working Nation, yeah.
And it happened with the GFC. So the idea that giving subsidies to existing business to hire people is going to do the kind of heavy lifting that's needed is nothing but theory, and it's fanciful theory at that. But even the keeping of JobKeeper and JobSeeker, and now we need to keep JobSeeker at a much higher rate because we're going to have so many people living on it. And if it returns to $40 a day, there will be mass poverty, and that will be generational poverty that we won't be able to pull out of. JobKeeper's a different issue, and the wage subsidy was very important because it kept people attached to businesses when we didn't know how long they were going to be closed, in the hope that they could come back, and that was a really important thing to do. But as we start to move through the recovery, there comes a point when you have to stop propping up zombie businesses, right? And certain businesses will fail, and it's about creating the new ones and investing in the new ones, and in the meantime stepping in to employ those people rather than just giving them money, because they will if they're feeling nervous, and particularly people on JobKeeper who've got mortgages and kids and commitments. They will save more than they'll spend. They won't use it for discretionary spending, which is what gets the economy booming. So actually it's a better thing to create jobs and give those people jobs in the public sector rather than a finite bit of income support that they don't know how long will last, that's attaching them to a job that may not be there. So
you look at this list, some of those really fit that bill. If you look at, social housing, you look at directly employing people in aged care and the universal early learning, they're all, and you wrote a lovely piece, which is part of the essay in the Guardian this week around the idea of a caring economy. But it does feel like this is a moment where we're going to get the hard edges of an economic downturn. But the good news is that there's a huge demand for work in those caring areas, aged care, disability care, early learning, social housing, where you could actually build an economic plan that creates jobs but also makes our society a little bit kinder. It sort of seems like an elegant solution, and it strikes me that if the Conservatives pulled on this, they would be unbeatable.
They would be unbeatable because 40% of workers actually work in the foundational economy, whether that's caring or retail or essential services, education, health. That's where it's the biggest employer. It's also one of the hardest sectors to automate, so it's not as vulnerable to technological disruption, and it's easy to make those jobs sustainable. So, if we invested in new social and public housing and retrofitted existing stock with solar panels, invest in care jobs, lift the pay and conditions, improve the quality of care, make early childhood education and care universally available to 3- and 4-year-olds, then more women go back. There's a really strong economic, quite apart from the ideological view of having a more caring society, but there's a really strong economic case to be made that that's the way to reconstruct in a way that's sustainable, because we also have to remember we can't just grow like Topsy by digging stuff out of the ground like we did after World War II, because there's a climate to worry about.
Hey, Paul, one of the learnings, I hate that word, one of the things we've learnt from this sort of period has been how pragmatic Morrison and Frydenberg have been. Why are they being pushed back into a more ideological economic response by their own base? Because wouldn't this be the pragmatic approach to take at the moment if you wanted to maximise your long-term political prospects?
It's certainly true that there was internal pressure from backbench MPs to, taper JobKeeper sooner rather than later, stop propping up zombie businesses, and the view that too much money was being spent on some of the economic support. So that was definitely an internal pressure that they faced. But I also think that trying to come over the top with a stonking great package for aged care and childcare does it not contain a concession in it that the aged care situation has been mishandled, that cuts to aged care when Scott Morrison was Treasurer was a huge mistake? And does it not take away the argument that they can try and run going into the next election, that Labor can't be trusted with an economic recovery because they're just going to splurge on programs that you may or may not get the benefit of? I mean, I think it would be great if going into the next election, both sides were agreeing to, massively top up funding in aged care and, free or much better access to childcare. But I just think that those things kind of increase the saliency of issues that people naturally think that Labor are better at handling, caring issues in a way that detracts from, the government narrative that only they can be trusted with money. So I think that's why it may not be the most likely thing.
Just as an aside on that aged care, we did ask about people's response to Paul Keating's HECS style, but the numbers of don't know were so high that the results didn't really mean anything, I don't think. So we've left that one out, haven't we, John?
Yeah, we looked at a bit more of the nuances of what was said and perhaps some of the pros and con arguments. But yeah, a lot of people, I think, had a lower engagement of it. Overall, though, when we explained basically what Keating had suggested, whether or not there was support or opposition, there was a bit more support. So we had 48% somewhat or strongly supporting it, compared to 30% opposing it. So not an overwhelming majority, but a slight favourability for support.
Okay.
Yeah,
maybe we should have left it in.
The people as well, which was the takeout from that.
Can I just say one thing, Pete, to that, which is really what Paul was saying about the narrative, the economic managers' narrative of the coalition. And, I'm not even pretending to be bipartisan on this. That reputation has been forged because the coalition governed during the biggest economic booms in Australia's history under Menzies and then Howard. They've never managed the economy out of a recession, not once. Menzies arguably did it by going back to Chifley's prescription, and it wasn't really a full recession. But it's only ever been the Labor Party that has pulled Australia out of recession. So if the Labor Party doesn't get on that narrative right now, I don't know what they're doing, because really they can say, well, look, every time we've recovered, it's been under a Labor government. This mob might be good at handling the boom times, but they don't know what to do in a downturn. That's just a bit of free advice for anyone from the ALP that might be listening.
And I desperately hope that they take that advice, because, some of the early suggestions that, Labor would be operating in a fiscally constrained environment, it's just wrong. I mean, they should go to the election promising more social spending and to sort of accelerate out of the downturn, accelerate out of the curve, instead of anything that even vaguely savours of austerity.
Yep. Yeah, there was that horrible little period where they were talking about who would be better at managing deficits and debt, which is the wrong question. At the moment, the question is, how do we rebuild the nation? And you're right. Labor's got a good story to tell there. My point always being, though, that the narrative has not to be that we are better economic managers, but we are better at helping people when they need help. And I think that's where I think the caring economy narrative could be really sort of compelling over the next little period. I feel like we've been in these slides too long and should come up for a chat with people, but we had a couple more. The tax cuts for higher income earners, 33% bring them forward, 38 nah, 29 stick to where we are. So about 2/3 don't think it's a good idea to fast track those, taking your point that they could separate them out, Paul. I thought this was also interesting. We had three sort of constructions of why the impact of tax cuts, and only 21% really buy that sort of, trickle down sort of argument, Emma. So that kind of feels that there's not a huge audience for that sort of logic.
Yeah, no, and I think, this chimes with the findings of our own annual tax survey came out last week. We found very low levels of support for the stage 3 tax cuts. And I think there was a an awareness in the community that they won't do much for the economy. And it was similarly divided along voting lines as well. So there was much higher support for the tax cuts amongst coalition voters, really low support amongst Labor and the Greens, and a higher level of understanding amongst those voters than there was for independent or other voters as well. So, you know, the public's not, the Australian public's really very economically literate compared to most developed economies. But it's shifting away from that idea that, and one of the other things we found in our survey, sorry to start talking about my own research, but was a massive increase in support for public debt to fund investment. So whether that is a temporary or permanent shift away from the obsession with debt and deficit will remain to be seen. But, you know, that's a really important conversation to be having. And I think the Australian public is economically literate enough to understand and engage with that.
One more slide before we come up for air, Paul, and this is what you're missing to be with us today. Look, the one thing that Angus Taylor is not offering in his energy roadmap, more support for renewables. Gee, again, what sort of pragmatic politicians are doing this? And really low. This is about prioritising what people would prefer the government to be supporting. But it is a very bizarre world in which gas is the solution to our problems at the moment.
Yeah, it's strange. They've sort of gone from doing everything they can to kneecap renewables, but, you know, from the Abbott era of trying to get rid of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, you know, through to Malcolm Turnbull getting overthrown over the National Energy Guarantee. They've sort of gone from trying to kneecap them to now saying that renewables are doing so well that you know, we don't even need to do anything to do. You know, they don't need any help at all. You know, so no investment in firming in the form of batteries. All we need to do now is just help gas as the backup and the top up for renewables. So a very strange attitude to this technology over many years.
Yeah, Emma?
Sure is. I mean, for a government who's, so there's no logical sense to this. There's no economic sense to it. The market doesn't want to touch it. And so we have this bizarre spectacle of a government that has always professed to believe that the market should make these decisions and the government should not pick winners, picking a loser. And actually intervening in the market to prop up something that the market doesn't want to touch. So there's no ideological defence for it. There's no economic defence for it. It's simply crony capitalism, if I can be so blunt. And the fact that 70% of Australians are going renewables, it's about renewables. And this government is absolutely flat refusing to invest in renewables. As Paul said, for many years they said, well, we can't, it's unfair to give them subsidies. Now they're saying they don't need the subsidies. Then I don't see that shifting no matter what the public opinion is. And because the last election, I think, was billed as the climate election and they won anyway, I think they feel fairly secure taking this road. So again, I think what we really need to see is really strong opposition on this. And if, you know, the ALP can't stand up and say, well, 70% of people are with us, renewables are the future. And I'd note that people, you know, Albanese is saying that, Mark Butler's saying that, but Joel Fitzgibbon's playing retail politics to his own electorate. You've got 70% of the populace behind you, then what the hell aren't you running hard on it? You know?
It'll be interesting to see whether in the inner city electorates that the Liberals win in their small L Liberal constituency. You know, Zali Steggall was able to take a seat off them because Abbott wasn't very popular, but has been running very hard on how their energy plan doesn't make sense and how there should be more support for renewables. Labor is definitely more split on the carbon politics between their city and regional constituencies, and all the downside and all the pain at the last election was on the Labor side. But there was a hit to coalition margins in their state, Sydney and Melbourne seats, and it will be interesting to see whether those are just one-off occurrences of an independent jagging a seat off them, or whether, you know, in the long term, smaller Liberals will become disenchanted with the very long-term commitment to fossil fuels.
I haven't really given people time to ask questions today because there was so much in the in the deck, and thanks, John, for all your hard work on that. Although Tony Simons has just made a point, and I'm interested in your view on this, Paul. Labor will be better off with Fitzgibbon as an independent. He's very destructive. He shafted Gillard. Discuss.
Well, the attitude they're taking to him at the moment is that it's okay to have internal debate, and, you know, the coalition gets away with the Nationals being rah-rah for coal, and the inner city Liberal moderates, you know, being against fossil fuels. So if the coalition can walk both sides of the street and preserve both those constituencies by just letting the Canavans of the world mouth off, then, you know, why can't Labor try that with Joel Fitzgibbon saying his 2 cents? But he is out there contradicting what Mark Butler and Anthony Albanese have said, that they will set a medium-term target, so maybe 2035, but some medium-term target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That is causing them some difficulty, and will play into a coalition narrative that they can't be trusted going into the next election. But I think his prescription of, you know, we'll take carbon politics off the table by just saying that we'll have the same targets as the coalition in the extreme short term, I think it would be a disaster. All it would do would switch the conversation from being here's, you know, Labor's proposal that's going to increase energy prices to being it's a secret carbon price. They won't even tell you, you know, what they're going to do if they were elected. So I can tell that, you know, he's trying to find a way out of a very difficult situation for Labor, but I'm just not sure it squares the circle.
A lot of very good people have been very damaged by this debate, Emma.
Look, the challenge is, right, it's the same issue as you have in America with the Electoral College. It doesn't matter what wins the popular vote if you don't win enough seats. So if it's going to swing, and it did at the last election, swing enough seats in those regional communities that are reliant on fossil fuels, and a lot of them are, whether they work directly in the sector or not, then it's a wicked problem. It doesn't matter how many people you take away from the Libs in an inner city seat where they've already got a 24% margin, if you can't win enough seats to form government. So it is a wicked problem for the ALP. The only solution to it, and I'm, you know, really heartened to see Per Capita's formed a partnership with LEAN, the Labour Environment Action Network. They're also doing work with the Manufacturers Workers Union and others to say, actually, it isn't a choice between jobs and action on climate change. The future is both, because where the new jobs are going to come from as the market exits fossil fuels, which it's doing, is from these new jobs in renewables. So that's absolutely the narrative that I think Albanese's been running on that now for over a year. But what we have in Joel Fitzgibbon is someone who's playing really hard retail politics to his own electorate on the national stage. And that's just the nature of electoral politics.
On that note, we're running down to the hour. Hey, Paul, thank you. It was great to finally get you on camera at the end there. It's lovely to see you. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, John. Thanks, team, for joining us today. Another great discussion. You know, the thing with politics is, you know, it's not a spectator sport. It's something that you've got to think about and be part of. And I think being part of a discussion like this just makes us all more engaged citizens. So thanks for being part of it. Thursday, we're going to be launching a report into social housing, Rental Nation, that's coming out from the Curtin Research Centre. And then next Tuesday, Emma's book launch with Albo. So I hope to see you all back there for that as well. But until then, look after yourselves. For those in Melbourne, hang tough. Only a couple of weeks to go. And for everyone else, you know, see you later in the week. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Paul.
Bye.
Thanks.